Today, retirement feels like a natural stage of life, something almost every one of us assumes will happen eventually. A certain age arrives, the working years end, and a new chapter quietly begins. But this idea is remarkably new. As a formal, guaranteed system, retirement in America is barely a century old. Before 1935, if you were an aging worker who could no longer physically do your job, the real question wasn't when you'd retire. It was, if your own family couldn't or wouldn't take you in, what exactly happened to you? The answer, for millions of Americans, was something far darker than most people today would ever imagine. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why some people, even now, with a fully functioning safety net in place, still go to remarkable lengths to avoid ever depending on it at all. For most of American history, there was no such thing as stepping away from work at a certain age simply because you'd earned it. Work wasn't something you retired from. It was something you did until your body physically stopped allowing it, or until you died, whichever came first. By some historical estimates, more than 3/4 of American men aged 65 and older were still working in the late 1800s. This wasn't because people back then were unusually hardy or particularly devoted to their careers. It was because there was, quite simply, no alternative. No pension waiting at the end. No guaranteed income. No safety net of any kind, unless you happened to be a veteran, in which case a modest government pension had existed since the Civil War era. A narrow exception that left the vast majority of aging Americans with nothing at all. If a worker's body gave out, arthritis, failing eyesight, a bad back after decades of physical labor, and they could no longer perform their job, their options narrowed dramatically, almost overnight. Some employers did offer small, informal gestures of goodwill to longtime workers who could no longer keep up. A reduced workload, lighter duties, occasionally a small parting gift after decades of loyal service. But these arrangements were entirely at an employer's discretion, offered as charity rather than obligation, and there was no legal requirement whatsoever to provide anything at all. A worker's economic security in old age depended almost entirely on the goodwill of others, the size of their own savings, and, above all, luck. For those whose families could take them in, life continued, often as a dependent relative in someone else's household, sometimes welcomed warmly, sometimes resented as an unwanted financial burden, but at least housed and fed. For those without that option, no children, no relatives able to help, no savings left, the reality was almost always the same institution, the poorhouse, sometimes called the almshouse. These were public institutions, funded by local government, designed to house the destitute of every kind. The elderly, the disabled, the mentally ill, orphaned children, all often mixed together under one roof. Conditions inside varied by region, but by the mid-1800s, many poorhouses had become severely overcrowded, poorly funded, and, by multiple historical accounts, genuinely miserable places to live out one's final years. There was also a deep social stigma attached to ending up there. Poorhouses were widely viewed at the time not as a compassionate social safety net, but as a kind of moral failure, a visible sign that you or your family had failed to provide for yourself. Local governments, worried about costs, sometimes deliberately kept conditions harsh, based on the widespread belief that making poorhouses too comfortable would somehow encourage more people to rely on them. By 1915, even the modest external financial support that did exist for the poor, what was then called outdoor relief, made up only a small fraction of total public welfare spending. The overwhelming majority of aid still came in the form of the poorhouse itself, a roof and little else. For an aging worker who had spent 40 or 50 years contributing to their community, this was, for an enormous number of them, how their story quietly ended. Historical records from individual poorhouses paint a fairly consistent picture across different states and regions, crowded dormitory-style rooms, minimal medical care, and a daily routine built around whatever farm or maintenance labor residents were still physically capable of performing, regardless of age. Some poorhouses operated with attached farms specifically so that able-bodied residents could offset the cost of running the institution, meaning that even inside a system meant to house those who could no longer work, there was often still an expectation that you would. Perhaps most striking of all is how normalized this reality was at the time. Newspapers of the era occasionally ran matter-of-fact notices about elderly residents who had died at the local poorhouse, treated as an unremarkable, routine piece of community news rather than a tragedy. For a huge swath of the population, this simply was what growing old without means looked like, and there was little public expectation that it should look any different. One particularly painful detail that historians frequently point to. In many poorhouses, married couples who entered together were often separated upon arrival, housed in different wings entirely, men in one section, women in another, regardless of how long they'd been married or how much they wanted to remain together. A husband and wife who had spent 40 or 50 years side by side might spend their final years living down the hall from each other, seeing one another only briefly, if at all, during shared mealtimes. For decades, this deeply flawed system limped along, propped up by a mix of family obligation, local charity, and sheer institutional inertia. Then, in 1929, the Great Depression arrived, and it exposed exactly how fragile that entire arrangement really was. The economic collapse wiped out personal savings on a massive scale. Workers who had spent their entire lives quietly setting aside whatever modest funds they could were suddenly left with nothing. Adult children who might otherwise have taken in an aging parent were now unemployed themselves, unable to support even their own households, let alone an additional dependent relative. By 1934, researchers working directly for President Franklin Roosevelt's administration estimated that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of all Americans aged 65 and older were now dependent on either public assistance or help from family and friends just to survive. Some states had already begun passing their own old-age pension laws in the years leading up to this point, but these programs were, in practice, almost meaningless. By some estimates, only about 3% of the elderly population was actually receiving any benefit at all under these early state plans, and the average payment amounted to roughly 65 cents a day, nowhere near enough to live on. The poorhouse system, already strained for decades, was now being overwhelmed by a wave of elderly Americans with nowhere else to turn. Local governments, already stretched thin by the broader economic collapse, could no longer keep up with the sheer number of people who needed help. It had become impossible to ignore. This was no longer a matter that individual families, or even individual states, could manage on their own. Eleanor Roosevelt, writing publicly around this time, captured the growing national unease directly, arguing that a country couldn't consider itself successful while so many of its older citizens, people who had spent a lifetime contributing to their communities, were left with no dignified way to survive their final years. That sentiment, shared increasingly across the political spectrum by the mid-1930s, helped build the momentum needed for what came next. There was also, notably, a colder economic argument working in favor of reform, separate from any humanitarian concern. Running poorhouses was expensive for local governments already stretched thin by the Depression. Some policymakers began to realize that a federal pension system, however novel, might actually end up being significantly cheaper than continuing to fund an overcrowded, failing patchwork of local institutions indefinitely. There's one particular figure from this era worth pausing on: a 66-year-old California physician named Francis Townsend. According to accounts from the time, Townsend, having recently lost his own job during the Depression, looked out his back window one evening and saw 3 elderly women picking through garbage cans for food. That single image, he later said, pushed him to devote the rest of his life to old age pension reform. In September 1933, Townsend published a letter in his local newspaper proposing something startlingly ambitious: a guaranteed $200 a month federal pension for every American over 60, on the condition that recipients spend the entire amount within 30 days, which he believed would simultaneously end elderly poverty and jumpstart the broader economy. Economists at the time widely dismissed the plan as financially unworkable, but the public response was staggering. Within about a year, thousands of local Townsend clubs had formed across the country, eventually claiming millions of members and collecting over 20 million signatures on petitions demanding Congress act. The Townsend Plan itself never became law, but its massive, undeniable popularity sent a clear message to Washington. The demand for guaranteed old age security wasn't a fringe concern anymore. It was a genuine national political force. Some historians believe the sheer scale of the Townsend movement directly pushed Roosevelt's administration to move faster on its own, more modest Social Security proposal, specifically to relieve the mounting political pressure. On August 14, 1935, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law, creating, for the first time in American history, a federally guaranteed system of old age benefits funded through payroll taxes paid throughout a worker's career. The rollout itself moved with remarkable speed. Workers seeking to participate simply filled out an application at their local post office and received a 9-digit Social Security number, tying their future benefit directly to their lifetime of contributions. Within just the first 8 days after the program launched, more than 1 million American workers had already registered. It's worth pausing on how genuinely radical this was for its time. For the first time, growing old in America no longer had to mean an automatic slide toward the poorhouse, or complete dependence on relatives who might not have the means to help. A worker's decades of labor were now formally, federally recognized as something that earned them continued support once that labor was no longer physically possible. That said, the original law was far from the comprehensive safety net we recognize today. In its initial form, coverage was surprisingly narrow, limited mainly to workers in manufacturing and commerce. This meant that farm laborers and domestic workers, two of the largest and often poorest segments of the American workforce at the time, were initially excluded from the program entirely. It would take additional decades of amendments and expansions before Social Security grew into something resembling the broad system Americans rely on today. Still, the shift in outcomes was significant and measurable. As the program matured over the following decades, poorhouses gradually closed across the country, one by one, no longer needed as the primary institutional option for the elderly poor. What had once been considered simply the unavoidable, grim final chapter of a long working life had, within a generation, become something else entirely, a guaranteed, if modest, foundation to build a retirement on. It's also worth noting that the very first Social Security checks were remarkably modest by any standard. The first ever recurring monthly benefit, paid out starting in the early 1940s, amounted to a payment measured in the tens of dollars, not a figure that would have supported a comfortable lifestyle on its own. The very first recipient offers a fitting illustration of just how new and untested this whole system still was. In November 1939, a 65-year-old Vermont legal secretary named Ida Mae Fuller happened to stop by her local Social Security office while running an unrelated errand, simply curious about a payroll deduction she'd noticed on her paycheck over the previous few years. She later recalled that she hadn't expected anything to come of it. She just wanted to ask what exactly Social Security was. She was encouraged to file a claim on the spot. That claim happened to be processed first, and on January 31, 1940, she received check number 0000001 in the amount of $22.54. Fuller lived to be 100 years old, eventually collecting more than $22,000 in benefits over her lifetime, against roughly $25 she had ever personally paid into the system. Her story became, almost by accident, the opening chapter of a program that would go on to support tens of millions of Americans. But modest as those early payments were, They represented something categorically different from anything that had existed before. A guaranteed, predictable payment that arrived every single month, regardless of family circumstances, regardless of local economic conditions, and regardless of whether an aging worker had any savings left at all. Over the following decades, the program expanded steadily. Coverage broadened to include the farm and domestic workers initially left out, benefit amounts were adjusted upward, and additional protections were layered on for surviving spouses and disabled workers. By the second half of the 20th century, Social Security had become such a deeply embedded expectation of American life that many younger generations found it almost impossible to imagine a country where it had never existed at all. It's worth sitting with how recent all of this really is. For the vast majority of American history, growing old without savings or family support meant, quite literally, ending up in an institution built for the destitute. The guaranteed retirement so many of us now take for granted is, in the full sweep of history, barely older than our own grandparents. And it's worth noting something interesting about human nature here too. Even now, with a functioning safety net firmly in place, some people still go looking for their own alternative path rather than relying on the traditional model of retirement at home or in a care facility. In recent years, a small but growing number of retirees have chosen an unconventional route entirely, living full-time aboard cruise ships instead of settling into a fixed home or a traditional care facility. In some documented cases, finding it genuinely comparable in cost to assisted living, while offering considerably more freedom, company, and daily activity along the way. It's a strange thought to end on. The same restless instinct that once forced elderly Americans into poorhouses out of sheer necessity is, in a completely different form, still quietly at work today. Except now, at least for some, it's a choice made freely, in search of something better, rather than a fate forced by having nowhere else left to go. Perhaps that's the real measure of how far things have come. A century ago, the fear driving an elderly person's decisions was almost entirely about survival. Where to sleep, how to eat, who might take you in. Today, for a growing number of retirees, the question has shifted into something almost unimaginable to their grandparents' generation. Not, will I have somewhere to go, but where would I actually like to spend these years, now that I finally have the choice?